Good morning. I would like to start off with a land acknowledgement. Although we find ourselves geographically dispersed today, meeting here in this online environment, I'd like to begin by recognizing that we all work, live, and gather on traditional Indigenous territory. We respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis Nation. As stewards of land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land and is grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. We invite you to acknowledge the traditional territories and treaty lands in your local area and encourage you to explore the interactive map at native-land.ca. Now a few housekeeping matters before we begin the webinar. Please note this presentation is being recorded. My name is Liz Feller and I'm a project manager for the Watershed Planning and Reporting team at TRCA. I've been one of the staff involved in the watershed planning process for the development of the Etobicoke Creek Watershed Plan. We also have other staff members from TRCA joining us as well as some of our municipal partners, including the Region of Peel, City of Toronto, City of Mississauga, City of Brampton, Town of Caledon, as well as the Greater Toronto Airports Authority. So tonight I'll be giving a short presentation on the watershed planning process, the development of the watershed plan for the Etobicoke Creek watershed, and the results of the watershed characterization, which tells us about the current conditions in the watershed, and the future management scenario stages, which allows us to see how watershed conditions may change under different land use scenarios. I will also provide a brief introduction to the next stage of the watershed planning process called implementation planning, which will involve the development of a management framework and actions for the watershed plan. We are hoping to obtain feedback on the priorities for action to address the key issues of concern in the watershed, as well as on the objectives and indicators which will make up part of the management framework for the watershed plan. This slide shows a map of the Etobicoke Creek watershed, which is a heavily urbanized watershed with 8 sub-watersheds. Sub-watersheds are a more geographically specific way of breaking the watershed into parts based on the various branches and tributaries. The watershed is located within the City of Toronto, Region of Peel, City of Mississauga, City of Brampton, and Town of Caledon. It lies on the western edge of TRCA's jurisdiction and contains a large portion of Toronto Pearson International Airport. The watershed is approximately 224 square kilometers and it continues to urbanize and lose natural areas. As shown on the map on this slide, urban land uses currently represent about 60% of the watershed, up from 53% in 2002. About 28% of the watershed is rural, down from 33% in 2002. Approximately 12% of the watershed is currently natural cover, down from 14% in 2002. The ongoing development of the watershed plan is a multi-year collaborative effort between TRCA, our partner municipalities, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Greater Toronto Airports Authority. Public and stakeholder engagement will be occurring throughout the watershed planning process. A vision for the watershed was developed through engagement with local stakeholders and residents and was agreed to by steering committee members. The vision states that Etobicoke Creek watershed is protected and restored to a cleaner, healthier, and more natural state to sustain its waterways, ecosystems, and human communities. So what is a watershed? A watershed is the land area that is drained by a river and its tributaries. Basically, wherever you are in a watershed. Watersheds provide many important benefits as identified in this graphic. Watershed planning is typically undertaken for 2 purposes. 1, to assess and understand the overall conditions or health of the watershed, and 2, to identify and prioritize measures to protect, restore, and enhance the health of the watershed. A watershed plan does not make land use decisions. The data modeling and evaluation included in a watershed plan help to develop a set of management actions that can be used by municipalities to inform land use and infrastructure planning decisions, while also providing an understanding of the natural systems that sustain watershed health. The importance of watershed planning is recognized in Ontario's land use planning policy frameworks. The provincial policy statement recognizes the watershed as the ecologically meaningful scale for integrated and long-term planning, and specifically requires planning authorities to protect, improve, or restore the quality and quantity of water. Watershed plans are required by provincial policies, including within the Growth Plan and Greenbelt Plan. We are developing a watershed plan for Etobicoke Creek for a number of reasons. The last watershed plan was completed in 2002, and a technical update of implementation priorities incorporating new information was completed in 2010. Scientific understanding and land uses in the watershed have changed since then. Since provincial policies require watershed planning to inform land use and infrastructure planning decisions, this new plan will incorporate the latest science, data, policies, and best management practices and will reflect current conditions. Also, municipalities are currently reviewing their official plans to ensure conformity with provincial policies, so the development of this watershed plan is timely. This new watershed plan will help us meet our vision for the Etobicoke Creek watershed and ensure watershed health improves to benefit the natural environment and the people who live, work, and play in the watershed. This figure represents the multi-year 5-stage process for undertaking watershed plans, with each stage building upon the previous one. The development of a watershed plan is divided into roughly 5 stages. Stage 1 is preparation and scoping. Stage 2, watershed characterization to determine the current conditions and health of the watershed. Stage 3, future management scenarios and scenario modeling, where we examine the implications of various potential future land use scenarios and climate change to understand how the conditions of the watershed may change. Stage 4 is implementation planning, including the development of the management framework and draft watershed plan. And lastly, monitoring and evaluation to inform future adaptations as the plan gets implemented. Public and stakeholder engagement occurs throughout these stages. The table on this slide outlines the process and timeline for the watershed plan. We've completed stages 1 and 2, so scoping and characterization, and we'll be finishing up stage 3, the future management scenario stages, shortly, with the completion and release of the scenario analysis report. This report presents the findings from all of the watershed modeling and technical analyses that we've completed for the watershed. We will begin the implementation planning stage with the development of the management framework later this spring and summer. The intent is to have the watershed plan and the draft watershed plan developed this fall and the final watershed plan ready for release in early 2023. Now I'm going to go through some of the key findings from the characterization of the watershed. The watershed characterization stage sets the context for the current state of the watershed by identifying key issues which will inform subsequent stages in plan development. For those who wish to obtain further information, I would encourage you to take a look at the watershed characterization report that was completed in mid-2021 and is posted on the Etobicoke webpage. TRCA studies identified key issues under 4 main components in the watershed, generally due to the heavily urbanized nature of the watershed. The first issue relates to the water resource system, which includes things like streams, lakes, aquatic habitat, in-stream barriers, and groundwater. The aquatic ecosystem is sensitive with high levels of annual runoff and degraded aquatic habitat. There's only approximately 50% natural cover within the riparian corridor near streams, and there are a large number of in-stream barriers that prevent the movement of species. The second issue relates to the natural heritage system, which is a system made up of natural heritage features and areas, including wetlands, forests, meadows, and valley lands, and linkages that are needed for healthy ecosystems. So primarily thinking about the amount of natural cover and good quality habitat. There are low levels of natural cover and urban forest canopy cover in the watershed, with natural cover continuing to decrease. The existing natural cover in the watershed is vulnerable to the effects of climate change in urban areas. Generally, the habitat quality is poor, with some fair quality habitat in the headwaters or upper portions of the watershed. The third issue is related to water quality. Water quality is generally poor compared to other TRCA watersheds. Contaminants of particular concern include chlorides from road salts, phosphorus from fertilizers, E. coli bacteria from sewage and animal wastes, and metals such as copper and zinc from industrial sources and roadways. The fourth issue is related to natural hazards, so in other words, flooding and erosion. There are 6 flood vulnerable clusters in the watershed, which means there are flood risks in these areas. Most of the watershed can be categorized as having medium or high erosion sensitivity. One other item to highlight is stormwater management. Stormwater is precipitation that is either absorbed into the ground or flows along the surface into storm sewers, streams, and lakes. In a heavily urbanized watershed, stormwater management infrastructure is important for controlling runoff. Without adequate stormwater management infrastructure, runoff will degrade water quality, increase channel erosion, and increase stream flow and peak flows during storm events. Prior to the 1980s, stormwater management focused solely on flood control, so stormwater quantity. Since then, stormwater management infrastructure has evolved to incorporate mitigation measures for water quality, erosion control, and water quantity control. As a result, more recent urban development in the watershed has stormwater management infrastructure, while older developments may lack any stormwater management controls. Only about 18.2% of the watershed has both stormwater quantity and quality control. An effective way to assess how a watershed will respond to potential future change is to compare several alternative potential future scenarios, each reflecting different possible land use conditions. In this way, scenario analysis is used as a tool to compare how possible future land uses might affect watershed health. 4 potential future management scenarios were analyzed for the watershed to assess the implications of different land use changes on the health and conditions of the watershed. This allowed us to test different management interventions to see how watershed conditions respond. The future management scenarios analyzed are hypothetical potential future land uses and not current conditions, and they don't represent specific municipal planning decisions. In other words, the scenarios do not constitute a land use decision or a particular recommendation on land use patterns and specific management interventions. The future management scenario analysis incorporated the best available future climate data where possible to better understand how climate change will affect watershed conditions. The results of watershed modeling and technical assessments can be used to help guide potential management actions and inform municipal land use and infrastructure planning. It is the responsibility of the applicable municipality to determine the ultimate land use configuration for any future changes within the watershed. Scenario 1 from this table represents urban expansion with minimal enhancements. It assumes further urbanization in the headwaters, which is the upper portion of the watershed. This means we've assumed that the remaining land in the headwaters outside the greenbelt is urbanized, consistent with growth projections and typical development patterns. This scenario doesn't include any enhancements to natural cover or stormwater management. So this scenario compares current conditions from watershed characterization to further urbanization in the headwaters with minimal other watershed intervention. Scenario 2 represents the same urban expansion as Scenario 1 with mid-range enhancements to stormwater management, urban forest, and natural cover, and also includes the potential GTA West Highway. This scenario compares additional watershed interventions to Scenario 1. Scenario 3 represents the same urban expansion as Scenario 1 with optimal enhancements to stormwater management, urban forest, and natural cover. So this scenario compares an even higher level of watershed interventions to Scenario 1. Scenario 4 is the same as Scenario 3 with optimal enhancements, except the current urban boundary is maintained in the headwaters. So this scenario compares the same high levels of interventions as Scenario 3 without further urbanization in the headwaters to Scenario 1. It is important to emphasize that during the scenario analysis for all the technical components, Scenario 1 was compared to current conditions in the watershed, while Scenarios 2, 3, and 4 were compared to Scenario 1. This allowed us to model, analyze, and compare the 4 potential future scenarios. Scenario 2, 3, and 4 have a gradual progression in the level of interventions focused on natural cover enhancements and improvements to stormwater management. So by comparing these 3 scenarios to Scenario 1 with no enhancements, we were able to see the relative benefits of the enhancements on watershed conditions. The maps on this slide show all 4 of the future management scenarios and what these future scenarios would look like by land use in the watershed. So by urban, rural, and natural land use, including both existing and potential natural cover. The gray in the maps represent urban land use, light yellow is rural land use, dark green is existing natural cover, and dark yellow is potential natural cover. This map is based on 2019 land use data. The future scenarios 1 through 4 maps were developed in 2021 based on best available information and data at the time with guidance from the Etobicoke Creek Watershed Plan Steering Committee. At the time the future scenario maps were developed, many municipalities were in the process of updating their official plans. Thus, the land use boundary and projected urban boundaries may differ slightly from mapping in municipal official plans. However, these differences are not expected to change the key messages of the analysis and still provide useful insights to inform decision making. So as part of the future management scenario analysis, TRCA conducted watershed modeling and performed technical analyses to determine how the watershed may respond to future land uses and climate change where possible. To communicate the results of the scenario analysis stage, the 4 key issues identified during the characterization stage, so the water resource system, natural heritage system, water quality, and natural hazards, and the implications of each of the 4 scenarios are presented in this table based on % change across the 4 scenarios. And as noted previously, scenario 1 is compared to current conditions, while scenarios 2, 3, and 4 are compared to scenario 1. The severity of change was expressed by whether watershed conditions improve, which is the green arrow up, stay roughly the same, which is the blue equal sign, deteriorate, the orange arrow down, or significantly deteriorate, which is the purple arrow down, from a hydrologic and ecological perspective. The table on this slide represents the key messages from the results of the scenario analysis for each key issue or watershed component. The scenario analysis report includes more detailed information, so I encourage you to take a look at this report when it is posted on the Etobicoke webpage, which will hopefully be in around mid-June. The next few slides will review the results for each watershed component in a bit more detail. So for the water resource system, % change in aquatic habitat quality was based on changes to impervious cover, so in other words, hard surfaces. These hard surfaces that increase with urbanization prevent water from seeping into the ground, and instead water flows over these hard surfaces and directly into streams, affecting aquatic species and their habitat. So impervious cover represents a good metric for determining potential impacts to aquatic habitat quality. Habitat quality was then determined based on the impervious cover within the watershed, and as shown on this map was given 1 of 4 classes. Less than 10% impervious cover was considered sensitive but stable for channel stability, good for water quality, and good for biodiversity. Impervious cover between 11 and 25% was considered urbanizing and impacted. Impervious cover between 26 and 60% was considered non-supporting, meaning unstable channels. Fair to poor water quality and poor biodiversity, and impervious cover greater than 60% was considered urban drainage. The main message is that aquatic habitat quality is expected to decrease as impervious surfaces increase. As you can see from the map, the impacts of increased impervious surfaces and effects on aquatic habitat quality are concentrated in the headwaters or upper portion of the watershed, as this is where the urban expansion is assumed in scenarios 1 to 3. So looking at the scenario results table on this slide, in scenario 1, we have a negative 9% change from current conditions due to increased impervious cover as a result of the urban expansion assumed in scenario 1. This represents a rise in impervious cover in the watershed from 47.9% in current conditions to 52.1% in scenario 1. Then you see slight improvements with scenarios 2 and 3, but still only improving by 1 and 4% from scenario 1. So impervious cover of 51.5% for scenario 2 and 50.1% for scenario 3, which reflects the natural cover and stormwater management enhancements. Scenario 4 sees an improvement by 10% from scenario 1. However, even under scenario 4, with existing urban boundaries, so less impervious cover and optimal improvements, the percent of impervious cover for the watershed is about 47%. which means the aquatic habitat quality overall for the watershed is expected to still be impacted and degraded even under this scenario. For the natural heritage system, percent change in the top results table on this slide is based on the amount of total natural cover or habitat quantity in the watershed. The map on this slide shows the existing and potential natural cover in dark green and darker yellow for all 4 scenarios. As you can see, the amount of natural cover doesn't change from current conditions in scenario 1, as this scenario doesn't include natural cover enhancements. The amount of natural cover increases by 59% in scenario 2 compared to scenario 1 due to the mid-range enhancements to natural cover, and represents about 18% natural cover in the watershed. The natural cover then improves greatly with the optimal enhancements in scenarios 3 and 4. This 95% change from scenario 1 means that total natural cover increases in the watershed to about 23%. These increases are achieved through the identification of potential natural cover. However, even with the optimal natural cover enhancements, this watershed remains below the recommended guidelines for natural cover quantity. These guidelines from Environment and Climate Change Canada's 2013 guidelines, How Much Habitat is Enough, recommend 30% forest cover and 10% wetland cover across the watershed. As the bottom table on this slide shows, even with the optimal natural cover enhancements in scenarios 3 and 4, only 14% forest cover and 3% wetland cover is reached. However, there are opportunities to increase the quantity and quality of the urban forest and natural cover to improve watershed health, increase climate resiliency, and provide socioeconomic benefits. In addition to habitat quantity, it's also important to manage habitat quality for terrestrial ecosystems and habitats to function. Higher quality habitat is generally larger in size, more circular in shape, and is impacted by the surrounding land uses. So an adjacent rural land use would have less impacts to habitat quality than an adjacent urban land use. Scenario 4, with the optimal enhancements to natural cover and no urban expansion, results in the greatest improvements to both habitat quantity and quality. For water quality, the percent change in the table on this slide relates to total suspended solids, or TSS, which is the amount of particulate matter in water such as silt, clay, etc. TSS can act as a surrogate to represent the impacts of other parameters of concern in the watershed, such as metals and phosphorus. The map on this slide shows the location of the water quality stations where data for current conditions was obtained. As you can see from the table, TSS decreases, which is shown as a positive change, with the scenarios that have enhancements. Scenario 1 resulted in higher TSS concentrations than current conditions due to urban expansion with minimal enhancements. Scenario 2, which has similar urban expansion as Scenario 1, demonstrates the improvement in TSS due to additional natural cover and stormwater enhancements. Average TSS concentrations decreased by the greatest percentage under Scenarios 3, which saw a 135% change from Scenario 1, and Scenario 4, which saw a 186% change from Scenario 1, where the natural cover and stormwater management enhancements are maximized. And in the case of Scenario 4, there's no urban expansion. The key message is that the predicted changes in this water quality parameter demonstrate the negative impact of urbanization and the benefits of improved stormwater management and natural cover enhancements. In terms of flood risk, the percent change in this table is based on the peak flows for the 100-year storm at the Dixie-Dundas Flood Vulnerable Cluster, since this is the highest risk flood vulnerable cluster in the watershed. The map on this slide shows the location of the 6 flood vulnerable clusters in the watershed for reference. The 100-year storm means that there is a 1 in 100 probability of flow being exceeded in any one year. The results shown in this table include when climate change is factored into the analysis and without climate change. Increased enhancements to natural cover and stormwater management, especially in scenarios 3 and 4, helped reduce peak flows, though not as much when climate change is factored in. The main message is that land use changes can manage peak flows for all design storms through enhancement and interventions, assuming the stormwater management quantity criteria developed for the Etobicoke Creek headwaters is followed, but climate change with increasing frequency and intensity of storms will cause peak flows to exceed current stormwater management infrastructure design standards. In terms of erosion, the percent change in this table was calculated based on the amount of time erosion thresholds are exceeded in the headwaters channel. So scenario 1 with urban expansion and no enhancements results in a large percent change in the amount of time erosion thresholds are exceeded compared to current conditions. The percent change from scenario 1 then increases to 17% in scenario 2 with mid-range enhancements, increases to 32% in scenario 3 with optimal enhancements, and increases even more to 48% change in scenario 4 with optimal enhancements and no urban expansion. The main message for erosion is that increased enhancements to natural cover and stormwater management help mitigate erosion, which would otherwise increase with further urbanization. These results for flooding and erosion demonstrate the importance of ensuring that land use and infrastructure planning decisions are made to minimize and mitigate impacts to the watershed, regardless of potential future land use configurations. The information obtained during the future management scenario stage and through the analysis of the future scenarios combined with the watershed characterization information will inform the next stage of the watershed planning process, implementation planning. This stage will include the development of a realistic and achievable management framework for the watershed that will represent what needs to be done to protect, enhance, and restore watershed health. The management framework will consist of goals, which represent the outcomes to achieve, objectives, which are the specific statements about desired results or steps to be undertaken to achieve the goal, indicators, which explain how progress on implementing the objective is going to be tracked or measured, and finally, management actions, which specifically explain what needs to be done to accomplish the relevant objective. The management framework will focus on 3 main themes or goals related to the key issues identified in the watershed. So land use and infrastructure, how the impacts of land use will be mitigated, the water resource system, so how water-based ecosystems will be protected, enhanced, and restored, and the natural heritage system, so how land-based ecosystems will be protected, enhanced, and restored. This slide outlines the next steps in the watershed planning process and the timeline. The scenario analysis technical report with the results of the technical analysis and modeling will be released later this spring and will be available on the project webpage. We will begin the implementation planning stage with the development of the management framework later this spring and through the summer. The intent is to have the draft watershed plan developed by the late fall 2022 with another round of public engagement in late fall, early winter 2023, and the final watershed plan ready for release in early 2023. We would welcome your comments and feedback, especially on your priorities for action to address the key issues facing the watershed, as well as the objectives and indicators for the Etobicoke Creek Watershed Plan. The link on this slide will take you to the project webpage where you can find an interactive mapping tool to view watershed features and provide comments, the online survey on the watershed plan objectives, indicators, and watershed actions, and other project materials. Comments would be appreciated by May 20th. Once the comment period closes, TRCA will begin work with its municipal partners, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Greater Toronto Airports Authority to develop the management framework and actions for the watershed plan, and will incorporate the feedback obtained from this engagement. If you have any questions or comments after this webinar, please send an email using the email on this slide, and the project team will respond by email or arrange to discuss comments or questions further. We also encourage you to check out the online mapping tool and provide comments that way. On behalf of the project team, thank you for your interest in the Etobicoke Creek Watershed Plan.